The avoidant person left you emotionally depleted, drained, running on empty after giving and giving and giving, to a relationship where your offerings were received but never reciprocated, where your emotional water was consistently poured into them, while they offered nothing back except occasional drops that kept you hoping things would change, where you were left out to dry through their withdrawal and their emotional unavailability and their taking without giving, until you were depleted and exhausted and had nothing left to give to dynamic that was all outflow and no inflow for you. But then, after you finally removed yourself from this depleting dynamic, after you stopped pouring your water into their empty vessel, after you redirected your energy and your love and your care toward yourself and toward your own life and toward people and pursuits that reciprocated rather than just consumed, something remarkable and visible happened that the avoidant is now witnessing with profound guilt and regret and devastation. Your water is overflowing. You're thriving in ways you never thrived while depleting yourself for them. You're visibly happy and abundant and full of life and energy that you couldn't access while you were being drained by their patterns and their inability to reciprocate what you offered so generously. The metaphor is perfect and painful for them to witness. They left you out to dry by taking everything while giving nothing, by depleting your reserves through their demands for patience and understanding and space, while offering no equivalent support or care or consistency in return, by leaving you emotionally parched and exhausted through their patterns that required you to constantly give while receiving inadequate reciprocation. And now, they're watching your water overflow because you're no longer pouring it into their bottomless vessel, but are instead directing it toward yourself and toward connections that fill you rather than drain you, toward pursuits that energize you rather than deplete you, toward life that celebrates you rather than diminishes you. This overflow they're witnessing, your visible thriving, your obvious happiness, your abundant energy and joy and success, is devastating to them because it proves several painful truths simultaneously. You weren't the problem or the limitation in the dynamic, because without them you're flourishing rather than struggling. They were draining you in ways they didn't recognize or didn't care to recognize, while taking your offerings as if they were endless resource rather than precious gift, requiring reciprocation. You're capable of incredible abundance and overflow when you're not depleting yourself for someone whose patterns prevent them from receiving or reciprocating. And most painfully, they could have had access to this abundant, thriving version of you if they'd been capable of reciprocating and filling you, rather than only taking and depleting you. The avoidant feels awful watching this because they recognize they had a person who had so much to offer, who was capable of such abundance and overflow, but their patterns and their inability to give back meant you experienced depletion and emptiness while with them. And only now that you've removed yourself from their draining presence, are you able to access and display the overflow that was always your natural state, when you're not being constantly drained without refill. How they left you empty, while taking everything you offered without reciprocation. The avoidant person's patterns created dynamic, where you were consistently depleted through giving everything while receiving inadequate reciprocation, leaving you emotionally and energetically empty in ways that weren't sustainable and that necessitated your eventual removal from the dynamic. Understanding how they drained you reveals the specific mechanisms through which they left you out to dry. They left you empty by receiving your emotional support and understanding while offering no equivalent support when you needed it. Throughout the relationship, you provided consistent emotional support to the avoidant, listening to their struggles, understanding their patterns, being patient with their withdrawal, accommodating their needs for space, supporting their goals and their growth, You were there emotionally, consistently, offering support that required significant emotional labor and energy from you. But when you needed support, when you struggled, when you needed them to show up for you emotionally, they were unavailable. They withdrew. They minimized your needs. They couldn't handle your vulnerability. They made your emotional needs about them and their discomfort rather than about supporting you. This asymmetry where you provided consistent support while receiving inadequate support drained your emotional reserves, left you depleted, made the relationship all outflow and no inflow for you emotionally. They left you empty by taking your patience with their patterns while showing no patience with your needs or your requests for consistency. You demonstrated extraordinary patience with the avoidance patterns, patient with their hot and cold behavior, patient with their withdrawal after intimacy, patient with their need for space, patient with their inconsistency, patient with their inability to show up consistently. This patience required tremendous self-regulation, required suppressing your own needs for consistency and presence, required extending grace and understanding that was emotionally costly to maintain. But when you had needs, when you requested consistency or presence or follow-through, they had no patience. They became irritated. They framed your needs as pressure. They suggested you were demanding or needy for wanting basic relationship requirements. This asymmetry, where your patience was expected and exploited while your needs were treated as burdensome, drained you, left you feeling your reasonable needs were excessive when the reality was their capacity was insufficient. They left you empty by accepting your vulnerability and your emotional openness while remaining emotionally closed and unavailable themselves. You made yourself vulnerable with the avoidant, sharing your feelings, expressing your needs, opening your heart, showing your authentic self, including your fears and your wounds. This vulnerability required courage and created risk, cost you emotionally to maintain while they remained defended. But your vulnerability was met with their continued emotional unavailability. They didn't reciprocate with equivalent vulnerability. They didn't open up in ways that matched your openness. They remained defended and closed while accepting your openness without offering equivalent access to their inner world. This asymmetry, where you were open and vulnerable while they remained closed and defended, created dynamic where emotional intimacy flowed one direction, from you to them, without reciprocal flow back, leaving you depleted from continuously offering vulnerability that wasn't matched or reciprocated. They left you empty by consuming your time and energy while offering minimal time and inconsistent presence in return. You made the avoidant a priority in your life, making time for them, arranging your schedule around them, being available when they wanted connection, investing energy in the relationship and in understanding them and in trying to make things work. This investment of time and energy was substantial and was genuine offering of yourself, but they didn't reciprocate with equivalent investment. They were unavailable when you wanted connection. They canceled plans or kept plans vague. They were inconsistent with their presence. They offered minimal time while expecting you to be available on their schedule. This asymmetry, where you prioritized them while they fit you in when convenient, drained your time and energy without adequate return, left you feeling you were giving more than you were receiving because you were. They left you empty by taking your acceptance and your lack of judgment while being critical or dismissive of you when it suited their defenses. You accepted the avoidant with their patterns, with their wounds, with their limitations. You didn't judge them for their struggles, didn't condemn them for their patterns, offered grace and understanding and acceptance of who they were, including their flaws. This acceptance required you to suppress your own frustrations and needs for change, required extending understanding that was emotionally generous. But when it served their defenses, They were critical of you. They pointed out your flaws. They were dismissive of your feelings. They framed your needs as problems. They judged you for the very things they needed you not to judge them for. This asymmetry where you offered acceptance while receiving criticism drained your self-esteem and your energy, made you feel you were giving grace you weren't receiving in return. They left you empty by taking your consistency and your reliability while offering only inconsistency and unreliability themselves. You showed up consistently for the avoidant. You were there when you said you'd be there. You followed through on commitments. You were a reliable presence they could count on. This consistency required discipline and integrity, required you to prioritize the relationship, even when you might have preferred to do otherwise. But they offered only inconsistency. They showed up when convenient. They didn't follow through reliably. They were unpredictable in their availability and their emotional presence. This asymmetry where you were rock they could rely on while they were shifting sand, you couldn't count on drained you, left you anxious and depleted from never knowing whether they'd show up or withdraw, never able to relax into security that your consistency should have created reciprocally. They left you empty by receiving your hope and your efforts to make things work while offering only patterns that ensured things couldn't work. You maintained hope for the relationship, hope that things would improve, hope that they'd change, hope that your patience and understanding would eventually create conditions where the relationship could flourish. You put effort into making things work, communicating, trying to understand their patterns, accommodating their needs, working on yourself to be a better partner. This hope and effort required enormous emotional investment and energy, but they offered only continued patterns that ensured nothing would change. They didn't work on their patterns. They didn't seek help. They didn't try to be different. They simply continued the same withdrawal and inconsistency that created problems in first place. This asymmetry, where you were investing hope and effort while they maintained status quo, drained your reserves, left you depleted from trying to make something work with someone who wasn't trying equivalently. They left you empty by taking your love and your care while being unable to fully receive or reciprocate these offerings in ways that would have filled you in return. At the core of the depletion was this fundamental asymmetry. You loved them, you cared for them, you offered yourself genuinely and generously, and while they might have cared about you in their limited way, they couldn't receive your love fully because of their defenses and couldn't reciprocate it adequately because of their wounds. Your love flowed toward them consistently, while equivalent love didn't flow back to you. You gave and gave while receiving drops when you needed rivers. This fundamental imbalance in the flow of love and care was the core mechanism that left you empty, that drained your reserves, that depleted you until you had nothing left to give, to dynamic that was all outflow for you, with inadequate inflow to sustain the giving you were doing. The shock and devastation they experience watching you flourish without them. The avoidant person is experiencing profound shock and devastation as they witness your visible thriving and flourishing after leaving the relationship that was depleting you. Understanding the specific elements of their shock reveals why your overflow is so devastating for them to observe. They experience shock watching you flourish because they expected you to struggle without them, having underestimated your strength and overestimated your dependence on them. The avoidant likely believed you needed them, that you were dependent on them in ways that would make life without them difficult. They might have interpreted your investment in the relationship as inability to be without them, your efforts to make things work as evidence you couldn't imagine being without them. This belief created expectation that you'd struggle after the relationship ended, that you'd be heartbroken and diminished, that you'd take long time to recover, that losing them would be a devastating blow you'd struggle to overcome. But instead, they're watching you flourish, You're not struggling. You're thriving. You're not diminished. You're abundant. You're not taking long to recover. You're already overflowing with life and energy. This contradiction between what they expected and what they're witnessing is shocking because it forces recognition that they completely misread the dynamic, completely overestimated their importance to your well-being, completely underestimated your capacity to not just survive, but thrive without them. They experience devastation watching you flourish because it proves you weren't the limitation in the relationship, but were being limited by the relationship with them. The avoidant might have maintained belief that relationship problems were about your limitations. You were too needy, too demanding, too emotional, too much in ways that made relationship difficult. This belief protected them from recognizing their patterns were the problem. But your flourishing after leaving proves this belief was false. You're not too needy. You're thriving independently. You're not too demanding. You're creating abundant life without demanding anything from them. You're not too emotional. You're clearly emotionally healthy and stable. You're not too much. You're exactly right for life. You're building without them. This proof that you weren't the limitation but were being limited by them devastates them because it forces recognition that relationship problems were their patterns limiting you, their inability to reciprocate, depleting you, their presence in your life, constraining your natural abundance, rather than your limitations constraining the relationship. They experience shock, watching you flourish, because the speed and visibility of your thriving suggests you're relieved to be free of them, rather than heartbroken to have lost them. The avoidant expected grief process. They expected you to be sad for extended period, to mourn the loss, to struggle through heartbreak before eventually moving on. But what they're witnessing looks different. You seem happy quickly. You're visibly thriving not long after separation. You appear relieved and liberated rather than grief-stricken and lost. This speed and this quality of your thriving suggests interpretation the avoidant finds devastating. Maybe you're not heartbroken about losing them, but are relieved to be free of them. Maybe the relationship was burden you're glad to be released from, rather than precious thing you're grieving. This possible interpretation that you're flourishing because you're free of them rather than despite losing them is deeply painful to their ego and to their sense of having been valuable to you. They experience devastation watching you flourish because every marker of your thriving is evidence of what they lost access to through their patterns. They see you happy in photos, and they remember they had access to that happiness, but couldn't appreciate it. They hear you've accomplished something, and they recognize they could have been there to celebrate, but pushed you away. They see you building new life, and they understand they could have been part of that life, but their patterns excluded them. Every visible element of your flourishing is a reminder of what they lost, what they had access to, but couldn't receive properly, what they could have continued to experience if they'd been capable of reciprocating rather than depleting. The devastation comes from recognizing that what they're witnessing, your joy, your success, your abundance, could have been partly theirs to share if they'd been different, if they'd given back rather than only taking, if they'd filled rather than depleted you. They experience shock watching you flourish because it reveals you have emotional and energetic resources they never saw while you were depleting yourself for them. The avoidant is witnessing you with energy, joy, creativity, social vibrancy, success, confidence that they didn't see to this degree while you were together. This reveals that these resources existed in you all along, but weren't accessible or visible while you were depleting yourself for the relationship. The shock comes from recognizing you had all this abundance and overflow capacity, but it was being consumed by the relationship rather than being visible and available. They never saw you like this, so happy, so energetic, so thriving, because while with them, your resources were being drained rather than overflowing. This reveals they never saw your full capacity because the relationship prevented it, and recognizing what they never got to experience fully because their patterns prevented it is shocking and devastating. They experience devastation watching you flourish because your thriving without them challenges their belief that they were important and valuable to you. The avoidant needs to believe they mattered, that they were significant, that losing them should be meaningful loss. But your rapid visible flourishing challenges this belief. If you're doing so well without them, if you're happier and more abundant now than you were with them, what does that say about their importance to you? Were they less valuable than they believed? Did they matter less than they thought? Was the relationship less significant to you than it was to them? These questions are devastating because they threaten the avoidant's sense of having been important, challenge their belief that they were a valuable party in the dynamic, force recognition that maybe they mattered less to you than you mattered to them, which inverts the power dynamic they believed existed. They experience shock watching you flourish because your overflow is visible to others, making their mistake and their loss public rather than private. If you were struggling privately, if your recovery was happening slowly behind closed doors, the avoidant could maintain some privacy around their mistake and their pattern's consequences. But your flourishing is visible. Mutual friends see it. Social media displays it. Your life circumstances demonstrate it publicly. This public visibility of your thriving makes the avoidant's mistake and loss more painful because others can see what they lost, can witness the contrast between how you are now versus how you were while depleting yourself for them, can make judgments about who made better choice or who is better off. The public nature of your overflow makes their devastation more acute because it's not private regret, but is loss that others can witness and potentially judge. They experience devastation watching you flourish because it proves they could have had access to this abundant version of you if they'd been capable of reciprocating rather than depleting. The most devastating recognition is not just that you're flourishing, but that this flourishing could have been available to them, could have been shared with them, could have enriched their life if they'd been different, if they'd reciprocated your care, if they'd filled you rather than drained you, if they'd given back equivalent to what you gave. You wouldn't have needed to leave to access your overflow. You would have been overflowing while with them, and they would have been beneficiary of your abundance rather than observer of it from distance. This recognition that they could have had what they're watching from afar, if only they'd been capable of giving, rather than only taking, is perhaps the most devastating element of watching you flourish, because it proves the loss was completely preventable and was entirely consequence of their own patterns and limitations. Why your overflow proves everything they believed about the dynamic was wrong. The avoidant person's witnessing of your flourishing and overflow systematically disproves every defensive belief they held about the relationship dynamic, forcing recognition that their entire understanding was distorted by their defenses. Understanding what your overflow proves reveals why their previous beliefs collapse in face of evidence your thriving provides. Your overflow proves their belief that you were too needy or dependent was projection of their own inability to meet normal needs. The avoidant believed and possibly expressed that you were too needy, that you wanted too much, that you were dependent in unhealthy ways. But your thriving independence after leaving proves this belief was false. You're not too needy. You're independently thriving. You're not wanting too much. You're creating abundant life without needing excessive support from others. You're not unhealthily dependent. You're demonstrating robust self-sufficiency. This proves that what they labeled as your neediness was actually normal relationship needs that their limited capacity couldn't meet, that what they experienced as your dependence was actually your investment in the relationship that they couldn't reciprocate. Your overflow proves their perception of you as too needy was defensive projection that protected them from recognizing their own inadequacy in meeting reasonable needs, rather than accurate assessment of you being excessively needy. Your overflow proves their belief that they were the more valuable party in the dynamic was completely inverted from reality. The avoidant likely operated from unconscious belief that they were the prize, the more valuable person, the one you needed more than they needed you. This belief created sense of power and control that made their patterns feel justified. But your overflow proves this belief was completely wrong. You were the valuable party. You were the one whose presence was enriching. You were the one who had abundance to offer. They weren't the prize. You were, and they failed to recognize this until they lost you and watched you flourish without them. This inversion of their believed power dynamic is devastating because it proves they misunderstood fundamental reality of who had more to offer and who benefited more from the relationship. Your overflow proves their belief that the relationship was limiting. Your happiness was backwards. They were limiting your happiness, and the relationship's ending freed you. The avoidant might have believed that relationship itself was constraining both of you, that being together was limiting both people's happiness. But your overflow proves the relationship was specifically limiting you, not both of you equally. You're flourishing after leaving in ways that prove the relationship was constraint on your happiness, was preventing your natural overflow. The relationship wasn't mutually limiting. It was asymmetrically limiting where you were being constrained and depleted while they were taking without recognizing cost to you. This proves their belief about mutual limitation was false, and that their presence in your life was specifically what was preventing your thriving that's now visible in your absence. Your overflow proves their belief that you couldn't be happy without them was narcissistic fantasy rather than reality. The avoidant might have maintained belief that you needed them for your happiness, that without them, you'd be less happy, that they were a crucial ingredient in your life satisfaction. This belief fed their ego and made them feel important. But your overflow proves this belief was pure fantasy. You're not less happy without them. You're more happy. You don't need them for your well-being. You're thriving independently. They weren't crucial ingredient in your happiness. They were obstacle to it that needed to be removed for your natural happiness to overflow. This destruction of their belief that they were necessary for your happiness devastates their ego and forces recognition that their importance to your well-being was far less than they believed and might have been actually negative rather than positive. Your overflow proves their belief that their patterns were self-protective rather than self-destructive was completely false. The avoidant justified their patterns as self-protection. Withdrawal protected them. Distance kept them safe. Emotional unavailability prevented them from being hurt. But your overflow proves their patterns weren't protective, but were destructive. Their patterns drove away a person who was good for them. Their defenses destroyed relationship that could have enriched their life. Their self-protection mechanisms created the loss and isolation they were meant to prevent. Your thriving without them while they struggle without you proves their patterns didn't protect them but harmed them, didn't keep them safe but created catastrophic loss, didn't serve their well-being but destroyed their chance for connection. That would have been better for them than the defended isolation their patterns created. Your overflow proves their belief that time and distance would make them forget you and diminish the loss was wrong. Instead, the contrast intensifies their regret. The avoidant might have believed that with time and distance, they'd move on. The loss would diminish in significance. They'd forget what you meant to them. But your overflow visible over time has opposite effect. As time passes, and they see your continued and increasing thriving, the loss doesn't diminish. it intensifies. They're not forgetting you. They're thinking about you more. The contrast between your flourishing and their struggling makes the loss more painful over time rather than less painful. This proves their belief that time would heal and distance would help was wrong, and that watching you flourish from distance actually makes the loss more acute and the regret more intense than immediate aftermath of loss. Your overflow proves their belief that you'd always be available if they changed their mind was arrogant assumption rather than reality. The avoidant unconsciously believed that you'd wait, that you'd be available if they eventually wanted to try again, that the option to return to you would remain open indefinitely. But your overflow proves this assumption false. You're not waiting. You're building new life. You're not available. You're moving forward. The option to return isn't open. You've closed that door by investing in your own thriving rather than remaining stuck on them. This proves their assumption of your continued availability was arrogant miscalculation that underestimated your self-respect and your capacity to move forward, and that while they were assuming you'd wait, you were actually leaving them behind completely. Your overflow proves their belief that they made the right choice in creating distance or accepting the ending was catastrophically wrong. The avoidant believed, or tried to believe, that distance was right choice, that ending was best for both people, that they'd be better off. But your overflow while they struggle proves they were completely wrong. You're better off without them, that's true. But they're not better off without you. They're worse off. The asymmetry proves their choice was good for you, but terrible for them, that they made catastrophic mistake in pushing away or letting go of person who was actually serving their well-being despite their inability to recognize this while it was happening. Your overflow is visible proof they made wrong choice, destroyed something valuable, and are experiencing well-deserved consequences of that catastrophic miscalculation. What their guilt and regret about your thriving means for your validation and future. The avoidant person's guilt and regret about witnessing your flourishing after leaving you depleted has specific implications for your own validation, your healing, and your path forward. Understanding what their response means helps you interpret the situation in ways that serve your growth and your confidence. Their guilt and regret mean your decision to leave and to redirect your energy toward yourself was absolutely correct decision, validated by evidence of your thriving. You might have questioned whether leaving was right choice, whether you gave up too easily, whether you should have tried harder to make it work. But your overflow after leaving provides definitive answer. Leaving was correct choice. You're thriving in ways you couldn't thrive while being depleted by that dynamic. Your water is overflowing now that you're not pouring it into a vessel that couldn't hold it and wouldn't reciprocate. The evidence of your flourishing validates your decision definitively and proves that leaving wasn't giving up, but was choosing yourself, wasn't failure, but was success in recognizing when situation wasn't serving you and having courage to remove yourself from it. Their guilt and regret mean you were giving far more than you were receiving, and the relationship was characterized by profound asymmetry that favored them at your expense. The fact that you're flourishing after leaving while they're struggling proves the dynamic was asymmetrical. You were giving enormously and receiving inadequately. You were being drained while they were taking. You were depleting yourself while they were consuming without reciprocating. This confirmation of asymmetry validates your perceptions if you felt you were giving more than receiving, validates your exhaustion as a legitimate response to being drained rather than as your weakness or inadequacy, validates that the problem was the imbalance rather than you being incapable of sustaining balanced relationship. The asymmetry was real, was significant, and was unsustainable, and your overflow after leaving proves this definitively. Their guilt and regret mean your worth and your capacity for abundance were present all along, but were being suppressed by dynamic that depleted you. You might have internalized that you were less than, were not enough, were somehow inadequate because the relationship didn't work. But your overflow proves your worth and your capacity were always there. They were just being drained and suppressed by dynamic that took from you without giving back. You're not becoming someone new by flourishing. You're returning to your natural abundant state that the depleting dynamic prevented. This understanding protects your self-worth by proving you were always capable of the overflow you're now experiencing, and that the lack of overflow, while in relationship, was about the draining dynamic rather than about lack of capacity in you. Their guilt and regret mean you deserve relationships where you overflow because you're being filled, not where you're depleted because you're being drained. The most important implication of your overflow after leaving is the standard it sets for future relationships. You now know what you're capable of when you're not being drained. You've experienced what overflow feels like when your energy is directed toward yourself and toward reciprocal connections. This experience should set your standard. You deserve relationships where you overflow because you're being filled, where the dynamic is reciprocal, where you're giving and receiving rather than giving and depleting. No future relationship should be accepted that creates the depletion you experienced with the avoidant, because you now have proof that overflow is possible when you're not being drained. Their guilt and regret mean your capacity to flourish. Without them proves you didn't need them in ways they believed you needed them. Throughout the relationship, they might have operated from belief that you needed them, that they were providing something essential to your well-being. But your flourishing proves you didn't need them. You're better without them than you were with them. This proves any belief they held about being necessary to your happiness or your functioning was false. You were self-sufficient all along. You were simply choosing to invest your self-sufficiency in relationship with them, and when that investment wasn't reciprocated, you redirected it toward yourself with better results. This proof of your self-sufficiency protects you from any residual belief that you need them or need that relationship, proving you're complete and capable without them. Their guilt and regret mean any future contact or attempt to reconnect should be met with extreme caution, given they drained you once and would likely repeat pattern. If the avoidant sees your overflow and reaches out, if they express regret and desire to reconnect, this should be met with extreme caution. They drained you once, they took without giving, they depleted rather than filled, they consumed your energy without reciprocating. Without sustained therapeutic work addressing their patterns, they would likely repeat this pattern. Your overflow exists because you removed yourself from their draining presence. Allowing them back into your life risks returning to dynamic that depleted you, risks your overflow being directed again into vessel that can't hold it or reciprocate it. Extreme caution and requirement for sustained demonstrated change would be necessary before even considering reconnection. Their guilt and regret mean you should use your overflow to attract partners who appreciate abundance rather than those who would drain it. Your overflow is visible in your energy, your happiness, your success, your vibrancy. This visibility will attract people, and you should be discerning about who you allow into your life. Seek people who appreciate your abundance without seeking to drain it, who want to add to your overflow rather than consume it, who are capable of reciprocity rather than only taking. Your overflow is too valuable to pour into another vessel that can't hold it or reciprocate. Use your experience with the avoidant as education about what draining dynamics look like, so you can recognize and avoid them early in future, protecting your overflow by directing it only toward connections that reciprocate and add to your abundance rather than depleting it. Their guilt and regret ultimately mean Your thriving is the best response to their patterns and the best revenge, if revenge was something you wanted. The saying, living well is the best revenge, applies perfectly here, though your thriving shouldn't be about revenge, but should be about living your best life for yourself. But the reality is that your flourishing, your overflow, your visible thriving does serve as powerful response to their patterns and their treatment of you. It proves they were wrong about you. It shows them what they lost. It demonstrates you're better without them. It reveals they made catastrophic mistake. All of this happens naturally through you, simply living well, through you directing your energy toward yourself and toward reciprocal connections, rather than toward draining dynamic with them. Your overflow is validation of your worth, proof of your capacity, evidence of your strength, demonstration of your resilience, an inevitable consequence of redirecting your water from vessel that couldn't hold it toward yourself and toward life that celebrates it. They feel awful watching your overflow. Let them feel awful while you continue flourishing. Let their guilt and regret be their experience to manage, while your overflow is your experience to enjoy. Let them sit with consequences of draining someone who had abundance to offer, while you continue overflowing in ways that prove you are never the problem, and that removing yourself from their depleting presence was exactly right choice that allowed your natural abundance to flourish without obstruction.